In North Carolina, a Marine's estranged wife disappears without a trace. With no body and little physical evidence, naval investigators struggle to determine her fate. The remains of a young woman are found burning near a rural South Carolina road. For 5 years, her identity and that of her killer remain a mystery. In Virginia, a sailor in the United States Navy is found murdered in a vacant lot. Investigators must look among his shipmates to find the killer. Violence is an inescapable reality of contemporary life. And Navy sailors and U.S. Marines are not beyond its reach. When those who defend their country commit murder, it falls to special agents of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service to ensure that no one escapes military justice. North Carolina's Camp Lejeune is one of America's largest training grounds for the U.S. Marine Corps. But even here, where honor and loyalty are virtues, betrayal and murder exist. On March 27, 1999, Marine Corps Sergeant Whitman Wallace reported his estranged wife, 25-year-old Tanya, missing to military police. Though he and Tanya were separated, their 4-year-old daughter had been staying with him for a few days. Tanya was supposed to pick her up after she got off work the previous evening. But she never showed. Tanya's roommates hadn't seen her either, and they said that her vehicle was also missing. Whitman believed Tanya had run off with another man. The case was turned over to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, or NCIS, an elite civilian federal law enforcement organization whose mission is to protect and serve the Navy and Marine Corps and their families. Special Agent Robert Bratton, who headed up the major case response team, began the investigation into Tanya Wallace's disappearance.
There were some very real concerns about a mother of a 4-year-old child who was very close to her child leaving without any comment to the family that she was staying with at the time.
A few hours after the missing persons report was filed, word came in that Tanya's abandoned car had been found. Security guards at a nearby store had noticed it sitting in the parking lot since early that morning. An examination of the vehicle's exterior revealed the presence of small traces of human blood on the door handle. Agents and military police quickly spread out and began scouring the area for any signs of the young mother. But hours of searching failed to produce any clues to the missing woman's whereabouts. The vehicle was impounded for a more detailed analysis. Agents had to consider that with an impending divorce, Tanya Wallace might have gone missing on purpose. Looking for answers, agents went to check out her apartment and interview her roommates. One confirmed that recently Tanya had begun dating another man, but he was in the Navy and was currently deployed overseas. Tanya had made no mention of plans to travel. And since ending her relationship with the abusive Whitman Wallace, nothing seemed to be troubling her. The roommate added that since her split with Wallace, Tanya had become upbeat and excited about the new life she had ahead of her. She was committed to her daughter's happiness, and her roommate could not believe that Tanya would simply abandon her 4-year-old, leaving her estranged husband to raise her.
Based on interviews of her girlfriend that she was living with, the fact that she had never left the child alone for any period of time, in fact, was uncomfortable leaving her child with the father for any extended periods of time. We relatively quickly ruled out the idea that she had probably left with somebody willingly.
Before leaving, agents collected Tanya's toothbrush and a hairbrush for future DNA comparisons. Though agents remained hopeful that Tanya Wallace would turn up unharmed, all the signs were pointing to foul play.
When are we going to start searching?
But so far, they had no physical proof that a crime had taken place.
All right, I appreciate you coming down and talking to me.
No problem.
Sergeant Whitman Wallace was brought in for questioning.
On your way. You're free to leave at any time.
He insisted he had nothing to do with Tanya's disappearance.
2 days of
Though they couldn't seem to make their marriage work, he still loved her and their 4-year-old daughter. He said that on the night Tanya disappeared, he had been assigned to work desk duty from 11 p.m. until early the next morning.
Any friends, family?
He said he never left his post. Agents contacted Wallace's assistant, who also worked that evening.
I work for him. Well,
He confirmed that Wallace began his shift at 11 o'clock.
3:30 and explained that his wife had not picked up the child.
But 30 minutes later, Wallace asked him to watch his desk.
No way I can stay, man. I'm going to have to leave. Why didn't you
Wallace said his wife hadn't shown up to pick up their daughter, and he needed to go back home and look after her until Tanya arrived.
owe you? I appreciate it. I owe you.
Wallace left and eventually returned 2 hours later.
And so he was not
Agents realized that Sergeant Wallace had lied when he claimed he never left work that night.
You need to go stay with this kid. I appreciate it.
Now, they needed to find out what he was trying to hide. They turned to the only piece of physical evidence they had. A week after she was reported missing, NCIS Special Agent and Forensic Consultant Mike Maloney began examining Tanya's vehicle.
As soon as we opened the door, it was obvious that there was a great deal of blood in the car. It couldn't be seen from the outside. The interior of the vehicle was very dark, dark-colored carpet, dark-colored seats and interior. But once we opened the door, it was apparent that there was blood.
The carpet revealed a large blood stain, approximately 16 inches long and 13 inches wide. Examiners removed it for a more detailed analysis. The DNA profile of the blood found in the vehicle matched those generated from the samples collected from Tanya's residence.
Hey, Bob.
It was clear that something violent had happened to Tanya.
We've run the pattern a couple
But
of
without a
different
body,
times. We've run
agents were unable to prove that she was dead.
5,000 milliliters prove that she was dead. And
Special Agent
that's
Mike
what we got
Maloney
from the
devised a blood volume analysis experiment that could provide them with that
It's worth
proof.
the time we put into it. We felt that we could show that she had lost so much blood in that vehicle that she couldn't possibly be alive.
Agent Maloney first needed to determine how much blood it would take to create the same size stains as those left on the vehicle's carpet. They obtained carpet samples from the vehicle manufacturer and saturated them with human blood. Examiners determined that 1,850 milliliters of human blood, or nearly 4 pints, was necessary to create a similar size stain. And that would be nearly half of Tanya Wallace's total blood volume. No one could have survived such severe bleeding without medical assistance. For agents, there was now no doubt that Tanya Wallace was dead. And they were equally convinced that her estranged husband, Sergeant Whitman Wallace was responsible. But so far, they had no hard evidence to prove murder. With no body and only a blood-stained carpet to work with, forensic examiners of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service proved that missing 25-year-old Tanya Wallace was dead. And NCIS special agents believed her estranged husband, Marine Corps Sergeant Whitman Wallace, had killed her. But they lacked physical proof. And Wallace was no longer cooperating.
So you understand exactly what your rights are.
Believing the suspect may have tried to throw away evidence of his guilt, agents began searching the dumpsters surrounding Wallace's barracks. But the trash had already been emptied. NCIS Special Agent Robert Bratton refused to give up. Though it seemed like a long shot, he contacted the area landfill, where all of the trash from the Camp Lejeune dumpsters is brought.
They can tell you where trash that's picked up and delivered that day or any particular day is within just a few feet. We asked them at that point to isolate the trash that was delivered on Monday and Tuesday of that week.
The Marines' Chemical Biological Incidents Response Force located that spot and began sifting through the mountain of debris. After hours of searching, the team found and collected a large green military-issue sweatshirt and some women's clothes. All of the items were covered with what appeared to be bloodstains. DNA tests on the items of clothing showed that all of the blood had originated from Tanya Wallace. And for Special Agent Mike Maloney, it appeared that Tanya had been wearing the clothing at the time of her death, except for one item, the green sweatshirt.
We were curious as to who the sweatshirt belonged to, though. The staining was on the outside of the sweatshirt and saturated to the inside, so we were fairly certain it wasn't something that Tanya was wearing the night that she was killed. We examined the neckband of the sweatshirt and also the armpits, and there was quite a bit of debris, of old skin cells, of sweat and sweat saturation.
Examiners were able to extract minute traces of DNA from the skin cells found on the sweatshirt. Analysis showed that the DNA was consistent with having come from Sergeant Whitman Wallace. Believing they were closing in on Tanya's killer, agents searched Wallace's barracks room. Wallace was in the process of moving out, and the place had been thoroughly cleaned.
I don't know what they'll turn out to be.
When agents applied luminol and darkened the room, large stains emerged on the tile floor.
Yeah.
Tests confirmed that the blood was human,
He got the red out, but that's all we got out. The hemoglobin's still there, and that's what's
but the stains stopped abruptly where the carpet began. No blood was present beyond the tile flooring.
But we've got this line.
Convinced Tanya had been murdered inside Whitman Wallace's barracks room, agents began interviewing other Marines who lived in the same complex.
Thanks. What do you have for me?
One Marine recalled that a few days after Tanya was reported missing, Wallace paid him a visit.
And it's probably no big deal. I appreciate it, man. You don't know how much I appreciate this.
He said that he had an inspection coming up, and the carpet in his room was muddy and it would never pass. Wallace asked to switch the carpets, and the barracks mate agreed. But after the inspection was complete, Wallace never returned to switch the rugs back.
Appreciate it. Look, I'll give you a call, all right? All right, later on, okay.
In fact, it was still lying on the Marine's floor.
You have his rug now.
Yeah.
Hoping the rug contained the evidence they needed to prove Whitman Wallace was a killer, agents collected it and brought it to the lab for testing.
Yes, sir. ahead. Got it?
Agent Maloney examined the carpet.
We did the luminol test, and we found the rest of the missing pattern from that stain by the door. They matched together perfectly, just like a puzzle piece. A very large saturation stain of what was later positively identified as blood on the carpet that matched that pattern that had been so sharply cut off on the tile floor.
DNA testing revealed that the blood on the rug, as well as the blood on the tile floor, was consistent with Tanya's. Agents now had enough evidence to make their case. Sergeant Whitman Wallace was placed under arrest and charged with murder. Based on the evidence, agents believed that Whitman Wallace was unwilling to give up custody of his daughter and was resentful of having to pay child support. On March 26, 1999, after getting off work, Tanya went to her estranged husband's barracks to pick up her daughter. Whitman Wallace had made sure he would be there when she arrived. With the couple's 4-year-old daughter asleep in the next room, Wallace savagely beat Tanya to death. He put her bleeding body into her vehicle, drove to a remote site, and buried her. At a general court-martial, Sergeant Whitman Wallace pled guilty to kidnapping and unpremeditated murder. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. And as part of the plea agreement, Wallace led authorities to Tanya's remains. Even without the victim's body, NCIS special agents were able to quickly expose the deadly violence of a Marine Corps sergeant. But in South Carolina, it would take naval investigators years to unravel one killer's deadly scheme. On November 6, 1989, a man driving along an isolated road in Jasper County, South Carolina, noticed something burning on the side of the road. Fearing it could spark a larger fire, he went to extinguish it. The fire was emanating from a large green duffel bag. And inside the bag, the man saw what appeared to be the charred remains of a human body. He called 911. Deputies from the Jasper County Sheriff's Office raced to the scene. The person found inside the duffel bag was burned beyond recognition, and the skull had been smashed. The only clue to the victim's identity was a unicorn print nightgown that had survived the blaze, indicating this person was likely female. According to Jasper County Detective Sam Woodward, investigators found little else.
Only thing we had was a female body in a duffel bag that was set afire. Basically, that's all we had. We didn't have no footprints, no tire tracks, nothing like that.
Believing that the victim's identity would reveal her killer, police hoped an autopsy would yield valuable information.
The weight? 165, 165.
Analysis of the remains led the medical examiner to conclude that the female victim was Caucasian, around 25 years old, with dark brown hair. An enlarged uterus indicated that she had recently given birth. Her death had been brutal. She had been hit in the head 32 times with a blunt instrument. Police entered what little information they had into a national law enforcement database containing descriptions of missing persons. They also checked all local missing persons reports. But none of the reports matched the description of this Jane Doe. Authorities knew their only hope of identifying this victim was to reconstruct her face as it had been in life. For help, Police called upon the expertise of Dr. Ted Rathbun, professor of anthropology at the University of South Carolina. He quickly realized this task would not be easy.
In a complete human skull, there are 22 separate bones of the skull and face. But in this instance, due to the massive trauma, there were at least 122 fragments to deal with. Some as large as the palm of your hand, others as small as half of your little fingernail. So that it really was a jigsaw puzzle, a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
After 8 days, Dr. Rathbun had successfully rebuilt the skull.
I was able to provide law enforcement and the forensic artists with a completed skull that was held together with glue, with supporting sticks and clay, so that photographs could be taken and oriented, representing an individual with a distinctive facial structure.
Forensic artist Roy Pascal of the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division was brought in. It was now up to him to bring this victim to life.
We do have that hybrid.
After placing rubber markers at certain points in the skull to indicate the depth of the flesh, Pascal photographed the evidence. Then he began drawing the face of the victim by hand in pencil. Four months after her body was found, Jane Doe finally had a face. Hoping to spark some recognition from the public, the victim's image was distributed throughout the area to the media and to local law enforcement agencies. But no leads were developed. 5 years went by without a break in the investigation. It began to look as if this case would never be solved. For investigators, it seemed that the identity of Jane Doe and that of her killer would remain a mystery. For nearly 5 years, a female victim found burning along a Jasper County, South Carolina road remained unidentified. Although forensic examiners had given Jane Doe a face, her name and the circumstances surrounding her death remained a mystery.
Go one time.
Years of searching through missing persons reports failed to produce a match.
It's just one of those things, Nick. It's just...
And by 1993, missing persons cases filed in South Carolina had reached an all-time high. But the rash of reported cases was not limited to the civilian population. Agents from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service stationed in Charleston were also inundated with similar cases involving military personnel and members of their families. Though they had formed a cold case squad to deal with the volume, their caseload continued to increase. In October of 1993, agents responded to the home of Kathy French. Her lifelong friend, 28-year-old Annie Tahan, hadn't been heard from in nearly 5 years. At the time of her disappearance, Annie had been living with her boyfriend, Michael Palan, a sailor stationed in Charleston. And though Annie and Michael had had a child together in 1989, their relationship had been troubled. Just after Annie became pregnant, Michael grew violent and abusive toward her. He would explode into a rage for no particular reason and threaten to leave her and take their baby with him. Annie began to fear for her life, but she vowed she would never give up her child. A short while later, Kathy moved out of state. And after giving birth to her baby, Annie wanted to join her, but was reluctant because Michael Palan had had her arrested once before on bogus kidnapping charges. A few months later, Annie called her. She was ready to leave Charleston with her baby and come stay with Kathy. Kathy said she wired Annie money for bus fare, but never heard from her again. Since the father of the missing woman's child was a sailor in the United States Navy, NCIS Special Agent Jim Griebus agreed to open an investigation. But given the couple's tumultuous relationship, he had to consider that Annie's disappearance had been intentional.
We felt that maybe she was in a bad relationship with Michael Palan and that she could have just fled, and that was a possibility we had to rule out.
A records check showed that electronics warfare chief Michael Palan was currently stationed at a naval base in Hawaii. Agent Griebus contacted agents there and asked them to speak with Palan.
Chief Palan, NCIS agents David Smith will talk to you about the whereabouts of Miss Dehan.
Michael Palan told the agents that on the morning of November 6, 1989, he woke to find that Annie had left him and the baby.
At what location did you say?
He remembered that she'd called a few days later, but didn't say where she was or what her plans were.
So you woke up that morning?
He hadn't heard from her since. Palan added that his mother, who currently lived in Savannah, Georgia, had since adopted their daughter. Naval investigators didn't believe Palan's story. For them, there was only one explanation as to why Annie Tahan was not with her baby.
We felt that if she was going to leave, which she wanted to do, she would have taken that child. That was the one thing she wanted, was to take that child with her. She did not want to lose that child. It didn't take us very long to form the opinion that she had been murdered.
Agents believed that Michael Palan had killed Annie Tahan. But so far, they had no proof. They began reviewing dozens of unsolved murder cases from throughout the state. In one of the files, dating back to 1989, Agent Griebus made a startling discovery.
That was a forensic drawing of a young lady that had been found in Jasper County on November 6th of 1989. And I took this photograph I had of Annie, and I looked at both of them, and I knew right then that this was Annie and that we had just found her.
DNA analysis confirmed that the mysterious Jane Doe was in fact Annie Tahan. And now, Naval Chief Michael Palan was the prime suspect in her murder investigation.
What's the next step yesterday?
Right, I went up to Sled yesterday and I met with him.
But NCIS Special Agent Peter Hughes knew that finding proof of his guilt would be difficult.
The problem we were confronted with was the fact that we were working a homicide case 6 years after the fact. So to start from ground zero and try and put these facts together was going to be a tremendous hurdle for all of us.
Results for the credit card.
Agents and local authorities began by trying to retrace Palan's movements at the time of the murder.
In Hardyville.
They sifted through his phone records for November 6, 1989. They found several calls placed to a number in Savannah, Georgia, located 100 miles away.
From Georgia.
The number belonged to Palan's ex-wife.
Right along the I-95 corridor.
Unsure of the connection, local police obtained her financial records. They found a receipt dated November 6th from a gas station located 25 miles from where Annie's body was discovered. Investigators began to theorize that Michael Palan had not acted alone. Agents traveled to Miami, where Palan's ex-wife currently lived. Though she denied any knowledge of Annie's murder, she remembered that one morning in mid-November 1989, Palan called her. He said that Annie had recently left him and he needed her to help take care of the baby. She agreed and drove to Palan's apartment in Charleston a day or two later to pick up the child.
So you did go to town, right?
But the phone records and gas receipts proved that she had traveled to the apartment on November 6th, the same day Annie was murdered. When it came to dates and times, she couldn't seem to keep her story straight. Agents confronted her with the receipts and asked if they would help refresh her memory.
Once she realized we knew she was in that apartment at about the time that Annie was murdered, she knew we had her.
Knowing she could be implicated in the murder, the ex-wife agreed to cooperate. She said that Michael Palan didn't want Annie in his life anymore, but wanted the couple's baby. Knowing Annie would never give up her child, Palan plotted to kill her, and the ex-wife agreed to help him pull it off. In the early morning hours of November 6th, Palan called her and told her it was done, and he needed her help in cleaning up the apartment. When she arrived just after dawn, she noticed blood everywhere. After helping Palan load Annie's body into the trunk of his car, she helped him shampoo the carpets and paint over the blood spatter on the walls. The information had brought agents one step closer to making their case. Now they needed to find physical proof that Michael Palan had done what his ex-wife had accused him of. She agreed to take agents to Palan's old apartment and walk them through the crime scene. Though the apartment was now vacant, the ex-wife was able to point out where Annie's body had been on the carpet. She also described the pattern of blood spatter on the walls and ceiling. But no blood was visible. And after so many years, agents were skeptical they would find any. Still, agents darkened the room and applied luminol throughout the area. To their surprise, blood was still present, and the locations of all the stains were exactly where the ex-wife said they would be. Though the findings had corroborated the ex-wife's statements and provided powerful evidence of Palan's guilt, agents knew it didn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was the killer.
Because when you look at the facts of the case, a defense attorney can easily say that this was a jealous wife who killed her. Not Palan, but a jealous wife.
Agents needed to get Michael Palan to confess to the murder. With the ex-wife's help, agents set a trap. She would phone Palan and coax him into talking about the murders.
Interesting enough, the opening comment that his ex-wife made was, Michael, they found the body. They found Annie. And his reply was, no, they didn't, which was of major significance in that an innocent person, of course, is going to say, what are you talking about? Body? I don't know, what are you talking about? But now he's on the phone and he's telling us, no, the police didn't find the body.
Got him to talk about the fact that...
After several days of intercepting phone calls, agents had heard enough.
Well, did you hear him deny?
3 weeks before he was scheduled to retire from the Navy, Chief Michael Palan was placed under arrest and charged with the murder of Annie Tahan.
Back, please.
Confronted with the evidence amassed against him, Palan confessed to the crime. Determined to keep his child, he said in the early morning hours of November 6th, he returned home from work to find Annie sleeping in front of the TV. Using a blunt instrument, he beat her to death. To conceal his guilt, he placed Annie's body in a duffel bag and drove to a deserted country road. He threw gasoline on the body and lit it on fire. At a general court-martial convened at the Naval Station in Mayport, Florida, Michael Pilon pled guilty to the premeditated murder of Annie Tahan. He was sentenced to 30 years at the Leavenworth Federal Prison.
Ask for comparisons.
Betrayal by a husband or a wife has become all too common.
This is our girl.
Or somewhere along the way we lost.
But military buddies claim to be loyal friends to the end.
In those areas. Much of the eyes.
On the morning of April 23, 1998, a man pulling up weeds near an apartment complex in Newport News, Virginia, noticed something lying in the grass. When he approached, he saw that it was a human body, and the male victim had been shot to death. The man went to a nearby apartment and called 911. Officers from the Newport News Police Department responded to the scene. They began searching the victim's pockets for any clues to his identity. Inside a wallet, they found several $100s in cash and an ID card. The victim was 23-year-old Stephen November, a sailor stationed aboard an aircraft carrier at the nearby Norfolk Naval Base. He had been shot 5 times. But the lack of any stray bullets or shell casings at the scene, combined with scuff marks observed on the victim's shoes, led police to believe that Stephen November had been murdered elsewhere, then brought to this remote location. No one who lived in the area had seen or heard anything unusual. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that the cause of death was a 9mm gunshot wound to the victim's head. 4 other bullets recovered from November's head and chest appear to have been fired from the same weapon. But with few clues and no solid suspects, police knew that finding this young sailor's killer would be a difficult challenge. Police in Newport News, Virginia, continued searching for answers in the shooting death of 23-year-old Stephen November, an enlisted sailor in the United States Navy. With little physical evidence to go on, police hoped a search of his residence would yield some clues. Police scoured November's records. One document caught their attention. It was a transaction record in Stephen November's name for a 9mm handgun, the same type of gun that had been used to kill him. But a thorough search of the apartment failed to produce the weapon. Looking to uncover any information, detectives contacted the victim's commanding officers at the Norfolk Naval Base. But nothing in November's records suggested any problems. He was a dedicated sailor and was well liked by his shipmates.
He funked it worse than anybody had ever funked it.
Hoping to retrace November's movements on the night he was murdered, detectives arranged to interview his friends and shipmates. Airman apprentice Hector Coleman said he and another friend were with November the night before his body was discovered. The 3 had gone out to run a few errands that evening. Around 10 o'clock, November asked the driver, Carlos Saldana, to drop him off at a nearby convenience store. November said he had some things to do, and he would meet up with them later. He had just cashed a large tax refund check and was carrying over $2,000 in cash. The two men watched November enter the store and then drove away.
He's a cool guy. Cool guy.
Coleman said they never saw their friend after that. Airman recruit Carlos Saldana, who had been driving the car that night, was also interviewed. He told the same story as Hector Coleman. But almost immediately, police sensed that Saldana was not telling the truth. Newport News homicide detective Lorenzo Shepard observed the questioning.
While he was being questioned, he appeared to be very nervous. He was very fidgety. He wouldn't look you directly in the eye, and those normally are signs of individuals who are being deceptive or not being truthful when discussing something.
Sure. Detectives asked Saldana to take a polygraph test. When the results indicated deception, he decided to talk. Saldana said the three had gone to the convenience store that night, but they did not leave after November went inside. The victim got into the back seat of the car a few minutes later, and they drove away. He said Hector Coleman then pulled out a 9mm gun and shot Stephen November. The motive behind the murder, according to Saldana, was robbery. Saldana had no idea where the murder weapon currently was, but he knew that the gun belonged to Stephen November. Carlos Saldana and Hector Coleman were both placed under arrest and charged with murder. Coleman denied any involvement in the shooting. With Saldana's confession, police believed they had an airtight case. But a month before the case was scheduled to go to trial, an inmate serving time with Saldana in the city jail came forward with information.
I've already been here for 3 months. I don't, everybody.
Carlos Saldana had bragged that he was the one who actually murdered Stephen November. He told the inmate that he had pinned it on Hector Coleman in order to avoid the death penalty. The inmate had provided reliable information in the past, and police had no reason to doubt him now.
Just let me know.
Investigators' strongest witness had confessed to being the trigger man. And now, a month before the trial, they were back to square one. Investigators knew that one of the two men in custody was responsible for Stephen November's murder. But until they could prove who had pulled the trigger, they knew they could never win a conviction. Police in Newport News, Virginia had 2 enlisted men in custody for the murder of Stephen November, a 23-year-old Navy sailor found shot to death in a vacant lot. Though Carlos Saldana told police that his friend Hector Coleman was the killer, Saldana later admitted to an inmate that he had actually pulled the trigger.
Coleman's been shot.
With the trial just weeks away, investigators were now in danger of losing their case. But they had another option, one that would allow investigators more time to build a solid case. Newport News authorities dropped all of the charges against Hector Coleman and Carlos Saldana and turned the case over to prosecutors of the Navy's Judge Advocate General Corps, referred to as JAG, who shared jurisdiction in the investigation. JAG officer Lieutenant Commander Scott Lang took the case. And with little physical evidence, he had to prove which of the 2 witnesses was telling the truth.
The challenges in this case were that we had only 2 witnesses, and both of them had a huge motive to lie. No one wants to get pinned with being the actual trigger man in a murder. So we did not want to commit our prosecutorial efforts to any one theory based solely on the word of someone with a motive to lie.
For help, Lieutenant Commander Lang turned to special agents of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service located in Norfolk, Virginia.
Well, I just want to go give everybody a brief here.
Agent Bill Heath was assigned the case.
they run into some problems.
His first step was to determine the truthfulness of Carlos Saldana's claim that Hector Coleman committed the murder inside his vehicle.
We wanted to go back to that vehicle and determine the feasibility of Mr. Saldana's statement. Could this shooting have occurred in this vehicle as he described? That was their primary objective. Is it possible?
An initial inspection of the vehicle, however, revealed no visible traces of blood or any other signs of violence. The search of Saldana's vehicle was turning up nothing, and it seemed that agents' best chance of exposing Stephen November's killer was slipping away. But NCIS forensic examiners are trained to look past the obvious. Special Agent Mike Maloney removed the rear seat of the vehicle where Stephen November had allegedly been sitting when the murder occurred. When he split the seat cushions open, he found the underlying foam cushion soaked in blood.
We'll do a hemodynamic to make sure it's blood.
DNA analysis confirmed that the bloodstains had come from Stephen November's body. Using a projectile trajectory analysis, Agent Maloney now set out to prove where the shots had come from.
We need to do a test on it just to make sure it is. Projectile trajectory analysis is a method by which you take the injuries or the wounds that occur to the individual and also any intermediate targets that the bullet may have passed through, be it the clothing, be it the seat itself, a wall, a window. And by lining those up, you're able to determine where the likely point of origin of that shot was.
A mannequin with Stephen November's bullet-ridden shirt was placed in the back seat of Saldana's car. Using the bloodstains in the seat cushion to approximate the victim's position, Agent Maloney concluded that the path of the bullets must have originated from the front passenger seat. Since Carlos Saldana was known to be the driver the night of the murder, agents could assume that Hector Coleman had occupied the front passenger seat position. But for Special Agent Heath, that was not enough. He needed to locate the murder weapon, which he believed was Stephen November's missing 9mm gun. A short while after entering the serial number into a national law enforcement database, he got a call. Police in Brooklyn, New York had arrested a man on a burglary charge, and in his possession was Stephen November's 9mm handgun.
When the gun was recovered, I was extremely happy that we had found that proverbial needle in a haystack. The next hurdle was determining, is this the murder weapon or not?
After ballistics tests confirmed that November's gun had fired the fatal shots, Agent Heath traveled to New York to find out how the gun got there. The man in custody claimed he bought the gun from a friend of his. Reluctantly, he provided agents with the name and number of the seller. Agents contacted the man who had sold the gun. Fearing for his own safety, he agreed to talk, but only in a secluded spot at a nearby park. When shown photographs of the suspects, he pointed to Hector Coleman, an old childhood friend, as the man who sold him the 9mm gun. Coleman told his friend that he had used the gun to commit a murder, and now he needed to get rid of it.
Once I was able to locate the witness in New York that actually purchased this 9mm from Mr. Coleman, his testimony became absolutely tremendous, because here we have a disinterested third party who, in a casual conversation with Mr. Coleman, was given all the details of the crime.
Though agents have no idea why Carlos Saldana had bragged to an inmate that he had pulled the trigger, they had proven that Hector Coleman had murdered Stephen November. Agents believe that before entering the convenience store, November asked his friend Hector Coleman to hold on to his 9mm gun. After driving away, Coleman said he wanted to fire the gun into the air. He asked November to make sure there were no police around. When the young sailor turned his back, Coleman shot him. He then robbed him of nearly $2,000 in tax refund money. Then had Saldana drive to a remote location where they dumped the victim. Saldana later claimed that Coleman threatened to kill him too if he told anyone about the murder. Carlos Saldana pled guilty to 1 count of accessory and 2 counts of false official statements. He was sentenced to 8 years confinement. A general court-martial was convened for Hector Coleman on August 18, 1999. He was found guilty of the robbery and murder of Stephen November. He was sentenced to life without parole in a federal prison. Violent crime poses a threat to every segment of society. But when a murder occurs within the United States Navy and Marine Corps, it falls to special agents of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service to make certain that no one escapes military justice. A missing man surfaces in a Texas swamp. Strapped to his chest is a chilling record of his final minutes. Texas Rangers hope it will help unravel a case of double homicide. Police have a suspect in a cold-blooded killing, just not the technology to match him to the crime. Will science catch up to the killer before he slips away for good? When a body appears on the side of a Texas interstate, detectives hit the road to stop a homicidal trucker in his tracks. In Texas, there's plenty of room to hide. But killers in the Lone Star State, be warned. Even the swiftest of criminals can't escape the long arm of the Texas Rangers. On July 27, 1982, Texas Rangers were called to an abandoned car in a remote drainage ditch near Santa Rosa. The inside had been torched. A check of the plates showed that the car was registered to Billy Staten, who, along with his girlfriend, Letty Castro, had been missing for 10 days. It was the first break in the case, and one that Rangers desperately needed. Once the car was pulled from the swamp, investigators noticed something even more suspicious. A rock had been set on the accelerator. It appeared that a deliberate attempt had been made to get rid of the car and conceal a crime. But the fire and days of exposure to the elements had erased all fingerprints and ruined any chance of linking the crime to a suspect. The rock was the only clue authorities had to lead them to the missing couple.
Not near.
But if the condition of the car was any indication, things didn't look good for Billy Staten and Letty Castro. Texas Ranger Bruce Castile feared the worst.
Well, after finding the vehicle, we started an extensive search with numerous individuals searching canals, brushy areas in an attempt to find Letty Castro and Billy Staten. We felt like at that time that they had been murdered.
Rangers combed the area for the bodies, certain that they couldn't be too far from the scorched car. They trudged through miles of dense brush along the drainage ditch for any sign of the couple. After 4 days of searching, they still had found nothing. But the Rangers weren't discouraged. They'd built a reputation on their ability to solve extremely difficult cases. The Texas Rangers were organized in 1823 by Stephen F. Austin to protect the first settlers of Texas from Indians. 50 years later, in the rowdy days of the Wild West, the Rangers earned their name as tough lawmen by tracking down bandits, bank robbers, horse thieves, and cattle rustlers. Today, Rangers are as tenacious as ever. As a state police agency, they're highly trained in investigative and forensic techniques to assist local law enforcement. The Texas Rangers tackle only the biggest and most complex criminal cases. And the simple missing persons case was becoming more difficult with every day. Rangers questioned Letty Castro's brother, who told authorities that he last saw the couple on July 16th, when he stopped by the trailer she shared with Billy Staton. That was the same day they left to pick up Staton's 9-year-old daughter at his ex-wife's house. The two were going to be married soon and hoped to obtain full-time custody of the girl. But their dreams disappeared just as quickly as they did. The Rangers also learned from Letty Castro's brother of the Statons' ugly custody battle. Billy Staton retained rights to keep his daughter every other weekend. His ex-wife Sherry didn't like to comply. Pickups were an especially distressing time. On checking up on Staton's ex-wife, Rangers learned that Sherry and her new husband, Paul Wolf, had moved the day after Billy Staton and Letty Castro disappeared.
Probably within about 4 or 5 days, would be my guess.
When Rangers caught up with him, they claimed that Staton never showed up to pick up his daughter.
You bet. Just keep me posted, George. Good to see y'all. Take care. You bet.
The Rangers obtained a warrant to search the home that Paul and Sherry had vacated. A damp spot on the carpet encouraged detectives to probe a little further. What they found was puzzling. A small area on the back side of the carpet had been painted over. It seemed like a deliberate attempt had been made to cover something up. Sections of the carpet were shipped to the lab to see if technicians could determine anything. Agents tested the carpet. So they wouldn't destroy potential evidence, they removed some of the residue with a cotton swab. A chemical that changes color in the presence of blood was then added to the swab. The test was positive. The blood was human. Because of the limits of technology in 1982 and the contamination by the paint, they could not determine whose blood it was. But they discovered that the carpet contained a lot of it, and someone had gone to a lot of trouble to hide it. Upon closer examination at the house, investigators discovered tiny spatters of blood on the walls and curtains. They collected samples to send to the lab. If the bodies were ever found, the blood types could be compared. Something had definitely happened in the house. But the most interesting piece of evidence was found outside the home. It wasn't so much evidence as the absence of evidence, but it was rock solid. Ranger criminalist Joe Marchand uncovered precisely what had happened.
And we looked around and we finally found an indentation next to a tree where a rock used to be. So we went ahead and we had the rock at the time, and we went back and we basically fit it back as a jigsaw puzzle and put it back in its place.
Putting these pieces together, the Rangers turned to Paul Wolf, the husband of Billy Staton's ex-wife. This time, he changed his story. Paul now admitted that Billy and Letty Castro had arrived to pick up Billy's daughter. He told Rangers that Sherry and the girl weren't home when Billy arrived. Billy was so mad to find that his daughter wasn't there that he attacked Paul. Paul tried to defend himself and accidentally killed Billy with a metal bar. Billy's fiancée, Letty, heard the commotion and came running in. When she saw Billy on the floor covered with blood, she came after Paul. Once again, Paul Wolf said he beat her in self-defense, accidentally killing her too. Shocked and scared by what he'd done, Paul asked a buddy, Glenn Henderson, to help him dump the bodies in a drainage ditch. To get rid of Billy's car, he'd brought a large rock along to set on the accelerator, hoping to get the car to drive itself into the ditch. But it hadn't worked the way he'd planned, so he returned the next day and burned it. Paul Wolf admitted that he had lied the first time because he was confused and wasn't sure the Rangers would buy his story. Wolf then directed investigators to the bodies. Letty Castro's body was found floating in a drainage ditch 12 miles from where the car was located. Her skull showed the damage Paul Wolf described. But Rangers also saw that she'd been shot in the head. It didn't match Wolf's confession. Clearly, he was lying. About 10 miles away, Billy Staton's body was found, partially submerged in a steep canal. His head was crushed. When the body was dragged out, the detectives made a peculiar discovery. Under his shirt, strapped around his waist, was a mini tape recorder. It was in bad shape from the water, but the cassette inside was still intact. It was a puzzling find. Rangers couldn't explain why Billy wore a tape recorder to his ex-wife's house, but they knew there was the possibility that Billy Staton had recorded his own murder. The Texas Rangers believed that the clue that would seal their case was taped to Billy Staton's body. The tape recorder found on the victim was treated with tremendous care. Days of water and mud had ruined most of the mechanism. But crime scene analyst Joe Marchand was hopeful about salvaging the cassette.
The most fascinating piece of evidence that we found was the tape recorder that was strapped to Billy Staton's stomach. We pulled the tape out. We called the FBI laboratory and asked them, what are we supposed to do? And they said, has it been submerged in water? Partially. They said, good, put it back in water and send it to us in a container. And it's better to be in water than letting the tape dry out.
After 10 long days, the tape was returned to the Texas Rangers. The FBI had done their best to save whatever had been recorded, but it was still uncertain whether it contained anything vital to the case. Within seconds of playing it, the sounds of Billy Staton being brutally murdered were perfectly clear. Armed with the recording, investigators went back to the scene of the crime to precisely match actions to audio. They measured distances and timed out the events as they corresponded to the sounds on the tape. The blood found in the house had been matched to Billy Staton. Now, the patterns of the blood would tell more of the story. All the bloodstains on the wall had tiny tails, like teardrops. By studying and measuring those tails, examiners could determine exactly what angles the blood had come from.
Joe, this is a case.
Combined with the audio tape, they could then piece together where Billy was in the room at the time he was beaten.
Now, I
Sexual assault kit.
now I want you to go ahead and pass it on the roll.
The tape revealed to investigators exactly what happened that afternoon. Billy Staton showed up at the house and was invited in.
Billy's here.
Sherry Wolf and her daughter are clearly heard on the tape, refuting Paul's claims that they weren't home when Billy arrived. Detectives learned that soon after Billy's arrival, Wolf took out the trash. But the trash was just an excuse to get outside. He really just wanted to see if Billy had brought Letty with him, and he needed to grab the crowbar he'd hidden earlier. From the way the blood had spattered on the walls, and by listening carefully to the tape, it was obvious to rangers that Billy Staton had no idea what was about to happen. He was seated, waiting patiently, when Paul Wolf struck. Wolf's accomplice, Glenn Henderson, had been hiding in another room. Once their victim was slumped on the floor, the two went out to murder Letty, who was waiting in the car. Without a doubt, Paul Wolf's self-defense plea was a lie. These were cold-blooded attacks on unsuspecting people. While the tape continued to roll, the killers carried Billy out to his car and put him in the trunk. They knew they'd need to get rid of the car, as well as the bodies, and they took the rock with them. The fact that the murder weapons were planted and an accomplice was on hand helped to prove that these weren't spur-of-the-moment murders. They were planned in advance. Of course, what they didn't plan on was capturing their crime on tape.
And this is where they're looking. This is where they're looking to see where they're going to dump Letty. And you can hear the rocks hitting the bottom of the trunk, and they're traveling slow speed.
Wolf found a secluded area off a drainage ditch a few miles from the house. Glenn Henderson followed in his truck. The site was far off the road, and the grass was high enough to conceal a dead body. But something was wrong. Letty Castro was still alive. The killers, however, were prepared for such a hitch.
On the tape, you hear a single gunshot. Then you hear some yelling, which is inaudible. Then you hear the car door close in the vehicle and take off, and approximately 30 seconds later, the tape runs out.
For some reason, they decided not to dump both bodies at the same spot. They left their next victim 9 miles down the road. The car was disposed of just as Wolf had described. The hard work was over. Back at the house, there was quite a bit of cleaning to do. In the short time they'd left their victim inside, struggling for life, a large pool of blood had collected on the carpet. The co-conspirators had to rent a professional carpet cleaner to cover their tracks. But even that wasn't enough. Blood had seeped through the carpet, staining the underside. In an attempt to conceal it, they painted over the spots. To put the crime behind them, the Wolves went so far as to move out of the house the day after the murders. But nothing they could do would erase the evidence that Billy Staton had unwittingly recorded. Rangers discovered that Billy had worn the recorder on his lawyer's advice. He'd wanted to capture the appalling confrontation and Sherry's malicious behavior, hoping it could help him obtain custody of his daughter. Instead, he recorded his own murder. Paul and Sherry Wolf were both sentenced to life in prison for killing Billy Staton and Letty Castro. For his part, Glenn Henderson also received a life sentence. Most criminals unintentionally leave evidence behind, evidence that can condemn. But sometimes the proof is worthless. When even the latest technology can't finger a killer, all detectives can do is wait until science catches up. It was the morning of January 22nd, 1988, when Texas Rangers were summoned to a secluded farmhouse in Burleson County. They'd been called to check up on an elderly woman who lived by herself. Neighbors couldn't reach her on the phone, and there was concern that something might have happened. They were right. 72-year-old Lydia Schumacher had been murdered. Inside, Rangers discovered the gruesome scene. Schumacher lay partially nude on her bed. The sheets were bloody. She'd been bludgeoned and then smothered to death. The Texas Ranger Crime Lab in Austin was called in to process the house for evidence. Someone had clearly broken in the back door, and it seemed some jewelry was missing. Apparently, Mrs. Schumacher had surprised a burglar. There were no fingerprints to be collected, and the weapon used to beat her couldn't be found. It was likely that she was smothered with her own pillow. Officers turned their attention to the body and the bed. Serologist Donna Stanley, an expert in biological evidence, examined the crime scene and found signs that the victim had been raped.
So what we then did was we began to unravel the bed sheet by sheet. And from doing that, we covered any hair that we saw on the sheets and the bedspread. That was where it became apparent at that moment that we might have been dealing more with more than just with a homicide, that we might have had a sexual assault involved.
To track down the killer, Rangers began interviewing people in the area for any information. Within a week, Rangers had questioned all of Schumacher's friends and neighbors. No one could understand who could rape and murder such a sweet old woman. But eventually, 3 names came up of men who, for one reason or another, were considered suspicious by their neighbors. Detectives asked the men if they'd be willing to take a polygraph test. One by one, they were brought into the station, hooked up to the machine, and asked point blank if they murdered Schumacher or had any knowledge of the murder. Texas Ranger Bob Cannell was in charge of the case.
We had several suspects in the course of the investigation. One of them was a next-door neighbor. Another one was a person who was later picked up for indecent exposure.
2 men were questioned and released. The third suspect was a young man named Charles Supak Jr. Supak and his father had actually been doing some work at the Schumacher house on the day she was murdered. A background check revealed he'd once been charged with sexual assault.
Both feet flat on the floor.
He was subjected to a thorough interrogation about the crime, but he denied any involvement whatsoever. The polygraph confirmed that Supak was telling the truth.
No, sir.
All three suspects had passed the test, and Rangers were now left empty-handed. With no more leads, all they could do was hope to make the best of what they had so far.
Pretty good.
At the crime lab in Austin, Donna Stanley and her colleagues ran tests on the biological evidence left by the rapist.
Characteristics in the air that I feel very.
Once they determined the killer's blood type, they compared it to hair samples taken from the three suspects.
The medullary structure, the cuticle.
Out of the three suspects that I tested, 2 of them were immediately eliminated. The third remained as an inclusion in the blood typing test, and that was Supak. He was not eliminated on ABO typing.
In 1988, ABO blood typing narrowed down evidence to one of only 8 blood types. But with hundreds of millions of people sharing Supak's type, the test results were hardly enough to prove anything. Still, it was all they had to work with, so Rangers brought Supak in again. He had passed the first polygraph test, but investigators were confident that if he were guilty, Supak couldn't beat the machine twice in a row. They decided to try again. It wasn't difficult finding him. He was sitting in jail for possession of marijuana. Rangers felt that if he'd been under the influence of drugs during the first test, he could have possibly lied and still passed.
On the second go-round, he had been in jail for several days, and we knew that he had to be clean at that time. So we took him back for the second polygraph to the same operator, and he passed that one too.
No other evidence was found that could pin the murder on Supak. Authorities had no choice but to clear him of the charges. For nearly a year, Rangers struggled to find Schumacher's killer, but it was hopeless. On November 29, 1988, they finally had to suspend the case. A rapist and murderer roamed somewhere in the Lone Star State, and the Texas Rangers were powerless to stop him. It had been 3 years since Lydia Schumacher was brutally raped and murdered. The only suspect was cleared of all responsibility, and the case sat on the shelf collecting dust. But by 1991, science had advanced enough to warrant another look at the case. Serologist Donna Stanley from the Texas Ranger Crime Lab felt that the new technologies held promise.
We still had a little bit of evidence left, kind of hanging on to it, hoping that as a new technology came along, we might then be able to apply this evidence to that new technology and gain, yet again, some more information. I need to pull that file for some new
The first comparisons made between suspect Charles Supak's hair and body fluids found at the crime scene had been inconclusive. Forensic examiners had done all they could do. But since the initial investigation, a revolutionary new method for analyzing DNA had been developed. Called PCR, it enables scientists to get DNA from tiny samples like a single strand of hair or a speck of blood, something they could never do before. Stanley was optimistic that the evidence collected from the Schumacher house 3 years earlier could finally be used to nail the killer.
Okay, see you around.
Shortly after the case had closed, Sheriff Cannell had retired, and Texas Ranger Ray Kaufman took his place. Kaufman approved further investigation of the evidence and quickly reopened the file.
Okay, well, thanks, Bob.
At the time I got involved in the Schupak murder, I knew that DNA was making giant leaps in their ability to narrow down suspects, and I felt that this case was one that possibly DNA could help solve.
As the preserved evidence was sent to a genetics lab, rangers began questioning neighbors and relatives again, hoping to uncover more information about Charles Supak. They soon learned things about their suspect they'd never heard before. Shocking facts that made authorities only more suspicious than ever. Neighbors confided that Supak had quite a disturbing reputation. It was widely reported that he had unusual sex habits, including bestiality. But the most helpful information came from a man who recalled a strange and frightening night with Charles Supak. About 4 months after the murder, John Golson was awakened late one night by Charles Supak. He told Golson that he'd had car trouble and needed help. But something about Supak's manner didn't seem right. John reluctantly agreed to drive him back to his car.
Where are we going? Man, just going out this way.
While they drove around aimlessly, trying to find the car, Golson's suspicions slowly turned to fear. Supak had insisted on sitting directly behind Golson and spent the entire drive idly wrapping an electrical cord around his hands. Supak finally directed Golson to a remote area, but when they arrived, his vehicle was nowhere to be seen. Tired of the whole affair, Golson finally drove him to a garage. When Golson got home, he still felt uneasy. He and his wife inspected the grounds and found that their phone lines had been cut. The story took another chilling twist when Golson showed rangers where he'd driven Supak that night. Golson had no idea of the significance of the spot, but its importance didn't escape the rangers. Golson's trip with Supak led rangers to believe that their old suspect knew more about the Schumacher murder than he'd admitted.
This is the final location where Mr. Supak brought Mr. Golson that night. Supak said he'd parked his vehicle down or got it stuck down here by this tree line. This little lane here goes down to the Schumacher residence. It's maybe a quarter of a mile right down here.
Supak had returned to the Schumacher estate. Rangers knew it was common for a killer to revisit the crime scene, but it would take more than this circumstantial evidence to put the finger on Charles Supak. The lab had run complex DNA tests, comparing Supak's sample to the evidence from the Schumacher case. Finally, on March 8, 1992, the results came in. The DNA of Charles Supak Jr. was in the victim's bed sheets. The updated information finally gave Texas Rangers the evidence they needed to arrest the man they'd suspected for over 5 years. Once again, he was in another Texas county jail for vehicle theft. Faced with the undeniable DNA evidence, Supak admitted to raping and murdering Lydia Schumacher. In his confession, Supak told rangers that on January 20th, 1988, he and his father had finished some work they'd been doing around Mrs. Schumacher's house and were ready to call it a day. They'd spent nearly a week on the property, and Charles had been inside the house enough to know that Mrs. Schumacher owned some gold jewelry. He figured there had to be more valuables somewhere in the house. That night, Supak returned. He claimed he'd been driving around looking for something to steal when he thought of Mrs. Schumacher. Her house was terribly secluded, and she was elderly and defenseless. The house was quiet when he arrived, and getting in was easy. He He'd left a pipe in the yard that day. Now it was the perfect tool, and soon it would be the perfect weapon. Once inside, the prowler had a look around. He snuck into her bedroom and began rifling through her things when she awoke. Supak reacted by beating her in the head with the pipe. Before he left, he raped her and suffocated her with a pillow. It took nearly 5 years, but Charles Supak Jr. was finally convicted and sentenced to life for the murder of Lydia Schumacher. The conviction was a tribute to Ranger tenacity, as much as it was a victory of hard science.
Forensic science basically solved this case. If it hadn't been for the advances in DNA, I'm sure this would still be a pending case that would go unsolved.
It's easier to catch a killer, even years after his crime, if he stays put. But Rangers take pride in their ability to track down suspects on the run. In a state as big as Texas, it's a common situation. There's usually not much to see on Interstate 35 between Dallas and Oklahoma. But on August 8, 1994, that changed. A Cook County police officer spotted a body on the roadside near the Oklahoma state line. When Texas Rangers arrived on the scene, they found a dead white male in his 30s. He had been stabbed multiple times in the chest, neck, and face. Wrapped around his neck was a shoelace. There was a sock stuffed in his mouth. Judging from the condition of his body, it looked like he had been thrown from a moving vehicle. A bra and a baseball cap were discovered nearby. A pair of men's underwear were also recovered. They were obscure clues, but it was enough to start Rangers down the right road. Officers searched the body, but found no wallet or ID. The murder victim was transported to the lab, where fingerprints were taken for identification. The task of tracking down the killer fell to Texas Ranger Johnny Waldrop. Within 2 days, he received a positive identification of the victim from the fingerprints. He was a 38-year-old Dallas man. His name was James Sykes.
James Sykes had a real bad criminal history and was just a kind of a throwaway person. He didn't have any family background other than his parents, and had no money and had no job, and was a very bad drug addict and an extensive criminal history. Roadblocks we ran into is through the investigation. We would contact people and they would say, "Why do you care?" Well, we did care because he was an individual just like everyone else.
Door.
Sykes hung with a rough crowd. When officers tracked down his best friend, Murray Bracken, he was in a Dallas County jail on a drug charge, and he became the Rangers' first suspect. Bracken admitted that he'd been with Sykes just the day before his body was discovered. He even acknowledged that the baseball cap found at the scene belonged to him. But he was adamant that he had nothing to do with the murder. Bracken recounted that he and Sykes were partying at a motel when they met a truck driver and his girlfriend. The four used up Bracken's drugs, and at the end of the party, he asked the truck driver to pay his share. The truck driver didn't have the money with him, but said he could go get it. James Sykes went with the couple to make sure they didn't just take off. That was August 7th.
Murray sent Sykes with the truck driver to collect the money. The truck driver, for some unknown reason, gave his billfold with his driver's license to Bracken and said, "I'm from Ada, Oklahoma. I'm a truck driver. I've got to be in Phoenix in a couple of days, and this is good faith. I will leave my billfold with you, showing you that I'll come back with the money."
They never returned. And Murray Bracken said he emptied the trucker's wallet and threw away his driver's license. Unfortunately, that was the one piece of evidence that would have supported his story and provided a solid lead for Rangers. Now it was gone forever. To see if Bracken was telling the truth, Waldrop called the Oklahoma Department of Motor Vehicles to check for truckers who'd applied for duplicate licenses in the last few days. The DMV gave him a list. On it was a man named Terry Brown. He was from Ada, Oklahoma. Police records revealed that Brown had been stopped on a traffic violation shortly before the murder. At the time, he was driving a truck registered to a freight company in Carrollton, Texas. He finished his job and returned the truck to the company. But shortly afterwards, someone stole it off the lot. Brown was arrested for driving the stolen rig 2 days later, but was released on bond. Dallas police sent Waldrop his mugshot.
Hey, thanks for coming.
Rangers put the picture in a stack of photos and asked Murray Bracken to survey the lineup. Within moments, he recognized the trucker he'd last seen with his friend. He pointed out Terry Brown. The investigation was picking up steam, but to prove Brown was the killer, Rangers needed more than just the word of a criminal. They needed proof. The freight company was relieved to get their stolen truck back. Only now it was the major piece of evidence in a crime far worse than theft. It matched a description Bracken had given authorities, and they were beginning to believe that it was in the truck that James Sykes had taken his last ride. The Dallas Police Crime Lab was called in to search the vehicle for any signs that the victim had been inside. Rangers knew Brown had been in the cab. He was arrested in it. Trucking records showed he was driving on business until August 6th. Sometime after that, he returned to the lot and stole the truck. The company reported the rig missing, and it was recovered on the 8th, the same day the body was found. Everything pointed to Terry Brown as the killer, but Brown had jumped bail. No one knew where he was. The team scoured the cab and sleeper for clues. They got what they were looking for. In the back, on the walls, investigators found some small spots of what appeared to be blood. Careful examination revealed even more blood under the mattress. Some quick tests indicated that it was human. Detectives were sure that further testing would reveal it to be the blood of James Sykes. The evidence was bagged and sent to the lab for DNA testing. Rangers were confident they were now on the trail of the man responsible for the brutal stabbing. At the lab, criminalist Wilson Young used DNA testing to compare the blood to that of the victim. But what he found shocked Rangers and presented a major roadblock to the investigation.
We did a type on it, we did a DNA type on it, and found that actually from that rig that we investigated at that particular time, the blood didn't match the victim that we were looking for. We had some blood here, but didn't match the person we were supposed to match.
They'd found blood in the truck, but it wasn't the blood they'd expected to find. Apparently, someone else might possibly have been murdered there. Then Ranger Waldrop received news that only complicated issues further.
Another female was found, and she had a ligature around her neck and a sock in her mouth. And of course, we found Sykes with a ligature string around his neck, a sock in his mouth. So my initial gut reaction was that Murray Bracken was telling the truth, and that we probably have a serial killer out there driving a truck.
The case had taken an unexpected turn. At least 2 people were dead, and a serial killer was loose on the interstates of America. If Waldrop didn't catch up to him soon, there would almost certainly be more dead bodies to identify down the road. The Texas murders didn't stop. On November 7th, Ranger Waldrop received a call from police in Richardson, Texas, a town just north of Dallas. They'd just found another body. It was a woman with a string tied around her neck and a sock stuffed in her mouth. But this time, there was a twist. The dead woman was Terry Brown's mother. Brown and his girlfriend, Tina Sampson, were prime suspects in the murder. They had stolen his mother's car and disappeared. When Waldrop talked to Brown's last employer, he discovered that Brown was supposed to have delivered a load to California. He'd picked up their truck on November 6th, the day before the murder, and never returned. Once again, Terry Brown had stolen a rig and vanished.
We were very fortunate at this time. We finally had a turn of luck. This was the truck we were looking for. We found that he drove the truck to Oklahoma City and partied in it for a few days, and it ran out of gas and he left it. The Oklahoma City police found the truck abandoned.
Before Rangers had time to respond, the trucking company brought the semi back to Texas and had it cleaned. The crime lab was sent to search for any possible clues that might have survived the cleaning. Fortunately, the company hadn't wiped away all the evidence. Stains in the sleeper under the mattress were found that were most likely caused by blood. Judging by the size of the stains, it appeared that a lot of blood had seeped through the mattress onto the platform. But this was clearly a brand new mattress. The company had thrown out the old one, and with it some evidence vital to the murder case. Through a stroke of luck, the trash hadn't been collected yet, and among the trash was an old stained mattress. The large stains looked like blood and matched the stains in the truck. But detectives were concerned that days of exposure had taken its toll on the evidence. Everything was shipped to a lab in Austin for detailed analysis. At the lab, DNA was extracted from the evidence. The strands were chemically cut into smaller pieces. This allowed for an extremely precise comparison between the blood found in the truck and the sample from James Sykes.
I'm gonna need the light out.
By comparing the DNA fragments, technicians confirmed that the blood could match only one person in the entire world: James Sykes.
We were certain that the victim's blood was in the truck. In fact, I mean, when you look at the numbers, 1 in 5.5 billion, that pretty much indicates that that particular person was the only one that could leave the blood behind in the truck.
Terry Brown and Tina Sampson were found the next day. Dallas police caught up with the couple in his mother's stolen car, headed east.
We'll find that out in the court of law.
They were split up and interrogated separately.
She's telling the truth right now.
Once the evidence was presented before them, investigators were finally told the true story of what happened to James Sykes.
He was trying to rape Tina. She had him by knife point.
To make sure they paid what they owed, Sykes had gone with them to collect the money. Brown drove to a truck stop and told Sykes to wait in the truck while he went to get the cash. But Sykes grew impatient and decided to collect his money another way. According to the killers, he climbed in the back and demanded sex from Tina Sampson. She panicked and pulled a knife to defend herself. When Brown returned and saw the two arguing, he assumed Sykes was trying to rape his girlfriend. In a fit of anger, he grabbed the knife and stabbed Sykes. Sampson said she was so upset, she took the knife and stabbed him some more. Brown wrapped a ligature around his victim's neck and stuffed a sock in his mouth. Sampson said they left his body in the back for a while until they were ready to dispose of him.
And she told us about how they had driven around a couple of days later, had partied some more, done some more drugs while he was in the sleeper of the truck, and that they later decided to go to Oklahoma City. And along the route, she didn't know where they were, but they'd pulled up on the side of the interstate, and that Terry had got in the sleeper and just with his feet had pushed the body out the side door on the long side of the interstate, and then they went to Oklahoma City.
Though investigators couldn't get a conviction for the other two murders, Tina Sampson got 20 years for conspiracy to murder, and Terry Brown got life in prison for the death of James Sykes. The determination of the Texas Rangers paid off.
Well, this case, I think, epitomizes the Rangers that we have done for so many years. There's a very old Ranger saying that a man in the wrong cannot stand up against a man in the right that keeps on coming. And that's what we did in this case. We kept on coming.
The Rangers made their reputation over 100 years ago by stubbornly chasing criminals through all sorts of terrain, using any weapon available. And they're still at it, armed with the power of forensic science. Killers may continue to run from the law, but with technology as their sidekick, the Texas Rangers will never stop their relentless pursuit.